Welcome to the second episode of Small But Mighty. Security might be a big subject, but that doesn't mean people can't learn a lot in a short amount of time. We know people are busy, but they are still hungry for better ways to approach securing their organizations. So twice each month, we'll be hosting 15-minute coffee chats with innovators and thought leaders in the cybersecurity space to provide big insights in a bite-sized format. I'm Stacy, and this is Joe. We are your hosts from Attila Security. And today we are here with Ben Wald, founder and head of client strategy at Very. Hi, Ben. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been working on lately.
Goodness. Well, let's see a little bit about myself. I've been doing this for 8 years now. And so founded the company and, started as a small group of web and mobile application developers. And now we've grown into the company we are today with a heavy focus on IoT. And that kind of splits between consumer wearable devices and then industrial IoT is kind of the trendy term, which really just means working with either machine builders or manufacturers or internet connected things that are more industrial in nature. And so obviously in both applications, security is a huge consideration, both during the development and engineering process and then also when you have product live in the field. So happy to be here and happy to share whatever I can.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I hear coming into today's conversation, you have quite a few opinions about this, so this should be very interesting. We're going to start out and talk about what everybody's drinking today. So what is your coffee of choice?
I have an Ethiopian micro lot from a local roaster. I think Ethiopian is my favorite. I think it's from the Yirgacheffe region. Probably not pronouncing that right.
Oh my gosh.
And this brew is using a Chemex process this morning.
I think most of what you just said was in a different language. I'm drinking tea from Trader Joe's, so I love learning about new beverages when I'm on the show for sure.
And I'm drinking boring old Colombian 8 o'clock coffee, so I'm not super high tech coffee like you are, Ben.
No problem. To each his own. Yeah.
Yeah. When I do choose coffee, it's usually Folgers. I almost am embarrassed to admit that.
So I'm going to throw my one coffee opinion out here.
Go for it.
And there's like my coffee ritual in the morning is like a 25-minute process. And it involves heating the water to the right temperature. I've got a scale, I measure the beans, grind the beans, and then the Chemex process is like, several different stages, right? And, there are all these like nuances, how you pour the water into the coffee. And I was thinking about it and I was thinking, like what impact does this really have on the output, right? The taste. And what I realized, and this may be correct or incorrect on it, but all of these things contribute like marginally, like heating the water up to the right temp is maybe like a 5% improvement on end flavor. How you grind the beans is maybe like a 15%. The freshness of the coffee beans is probably like a 40%. And anyways, long story short, when you stack all these things together, then I think you end up with like a great tasting coffee. And so I say that to say
a developer to go and to like break down the percentage improvement every step has in the coffee making process.
Well, I'm going to tie it together to this conversation, which is, and this is
can't wait for this.
We're going to go for it. I think about security in the same way, that it's not about doing one thing right. It's about taking account of all of the little steps along the way and the like incremental improvement that you can make to your security framework. And like at the end of the day, you never get to 100%. Things built by humans can be taken apart and destroyed and hacked by humans, right? So you never get 100%. With coffee, we're probably not ever like extracting 100% of the possible flavor there, but all of these little steps along the way, you're getting incremental improvements and, you end up with something good at the end.
Just wow. Like
very
I don't
Very
even
well
think we need to
done.
have the
Man.
conversation now.
All
We're
right,
done.
I'm out.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into why we're here today. And what we really want to talk about is the importance of remote monitoring and manufacturing, and looking into what the future of industrial IoT really looks like. So tell us your opinions there. I'm sure you've got plenty, given how many you have about coffee.
Let's see. So, remote monitoring is a big topic. And, anything remote, and as a first word, is a topic of interest right now because of COVID. Everybody is thinking about, how can we optimize process, and in a situation where we can't send physical bodies to a particular place, how are we going to do our business? How are we going to secure things? How are we going to manufacture? How are we going to develop? And so the importance of remote monitoring is something that is definitely not a new concept, but I think it's one of the areas that is under spotlight right now. And we've seen in our line of business a lot of companies reach out to us, now that maybe remote monitoring was on 2022 roadmap, something out in the future that has now been shifted up in priority. And the remote monitoring aspect is, I think, takes a handful of different avenues for a machine builder. Extremely relevant to build in that capability, because as they are sending their machines onto customer sites, they usually lose all contact, right? Once they send it, they have no more visibility, whether that's because the facility that it's in is intentionally air gapped, or for whatever reason they don't send the piece of equipment with the technology to connect to a cellular backhaul, if they can't for whatever reason get on the wireless network. They don't, so what that results in is that the only time that the company is contacted is when something is broken, and then their customer is shoe banging and downtime and expensive, frustrated. Yeah, and then the thing that we've seen over and over again is as like maybe we'll call this a paradigm, is that there's no black box for typically for like industrial machinery. And what I mean by that is that when the machine builder gets a call, says this thing is broken, very hard for them in a lot of situations across industries for them to be able to go backwards in time and run like a thorough analysis of like what happened that led to that part breaking.
It's like the forensic side of it. Like there's not really a way to go back.
Exactly. So this lack of black box problem is something that we've seen across a lot of different industries that you can solve through equipping machinery and devices with proper remote monitoring capabilities.
It's like microchipping your dog, right? All of a sudden everywhere it's been.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the intro to remote monitoring and why it's important.
One of the other interesting things, and Joe, this might be where you were headed, so feel free to take it.
Yeah, I was just going to ask. That's interesting that you're looking at it from the manufacturer of the equipment's perspective, as opposed to the client that's using the equipment, in the plant or on the factory floor. So, do you find that you're working with more of the manufacturers to solve these problems, or are there product providers that the clients that are coming to you and saying, hey, I want to do something here and learn more about my internal what's happening on the floor and from a remote standpoint?
Yeah, both. So we do work with manufacturers, and with manufacturers, the ROI part of the equation is efficiency, is optimizing throughput, is implementing things that can like make small incremental improvements to cost, or like reducing scrap, those types of things. With machine builders, it's a very different type of an ROI equation, and so manufacturers, it's more about saving. Machine builders, it's more about unlocking new business opportunities and potential revenue streams. And so I think we end up working more with machine and device builders than manufacturers. Even though we have had some of those discussions, the question though is in a manufacturer setting, like how much are you actually moving the needle by providing better dashboards, or by providing better visibility, and like some needle movement, but not as significant as, with potentially the machine builder who has an SLA for that piece of machinery, or who,
Yep.
is the creator of a device that is out in the field, that, wants to know about aggregate fleet-based data.
Right. No, that makes sense. That does, and I can see it as a real differentiator for that that builder for sure.
Yep.
Thanks.
So let's look at then what are the security implications of doing this, right? Because now we're asking a bunch of machines to put a bunch of information out into the world that could easily be read by someone who shouldn't be seeing it. So how are you guys proactively approaching the security side of that conversation?
Yeah, it's a huge concern, and frankly, the main reason why a lot of manufacturing facilities are air gapped to begin with is just because even though it is well known, well established that putting data in the cloud or creating that connection has huge benefits. There are tons of machine learning models that you can apply to specific machines and do predictive maintenance out of the box. But the reason why I think people have pulled back is that the risk reward equation wasn't there, right? So you keep everything totally air gapped, because it's just not worth it if there's some type of hack. So I say that to say security is a huge concern. Security is something that we think a lot about. And if I were to, I don't know, throw like two starting points of advice or things to think about, number one would be not to overreach. And what I mean by that is that when we are thinking about, retrofitting machinery with, intelligence and sensors or cloud, connectivity capabilities, there is a tendency to want to try to do everything or build this to be extensible and build this to do, both, pulling data out into the cloud and also then, automatically sending new orders or corrections or optimizations back into the machine. And the thing that we pull back on and we say, every time you reach a little bit more, you create a new vulnerability. And so, for example, with remote monitoring, if you keep that device purely passive, all it can do is read, can't do any writing, right? It can't issue any orders. All it can do is read. You've dramatically cut down on a vector of vulnerability. So number one is don't overreach when you are building device connectivity. I would say number two is when even in a passive device, there's risk of something like data siphoning. And one of the things that we think about is pattern of life for devices, for equipment. And pattern of life is more or less that, I guess, put in simple words, this machine should be doing these things consistently within this threshold, right? It is running this number of cycles, it's sending and receiving this amount of data. And even, you can look at it from the operator perspective, like operators are typically doing these actions, and over a long period of time, you can assess what a typical pattern of life for that piece of equipment would be, and then when you have fleet-wide data, right, that becomes a richer data set, and when, we can look across industries, it becomes a much richer data set. And so you can start to use some of those indicators that can monitor, if a machine is acting unusually or operating out of threshold, and is an indication to jump in and see what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been seeing a lot of that as well, Ben, in terms of the AI aspect, right, is collecting all this data and then making, understanding how that particular piece of equipment works, and then, being able to pull out anomalies, as you say. Yeah, I see that becoming more and more popular. A lot of that stuff is in the cloud, though. Are some of the manufacturers doing that, on-prem to, because of the threat of security?
Good question. It's funny because there's this tension that we see across projects, where there's this, push to make the edges dumber, and then there's this totally opposite push to make the edges a lot smarter. right?
Yeah.
And so when we're thinking about building a system, for I don't know, some type of consumer electronic device, you typically want to keep the edges as dumb as possible, right? Which means that that edge computer, that device, has just as much compute power as it needs to function, but then you're doing all the heavy lifting in the cloud in terms of like a machine learning algorithm, or some type of predictive modeling, or whatever like heavy computation happens in the cloud, then sends a particular model maybe back to the edge. Then there's this other tension, which is when you have situations where you're dealing with like high frequency data or huge amounts of data, or you have a device that is sitting in a mesh network that is, that device might not have connectivity and it needs to connect to other devices in order to send packets, home. Then there's this push to make the edges much smarter, to where, they can actually run algorithms that will compress data, or that will do things that are computationally intensive. And so anyways, I'm seeing both moving forward, and the best that I can come up with is that it's on a case by case basis. I would think though that over time the edges are going to get smarter and are going to be able to hold intelligence and hold um, uh, security parameters to trigger from themselves, versus having to call home, or having to wait for the data to go back to the cloud, to be analyzed, and then some indicator starts flashing red.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yep.
Yeah. One of the other really interesting, like COVID related things we've seen with this that's newer has been the opposite direction, right? We're talking a lot about receiving information from these edge devices, but all of a sudden there's people who can't go into the plant to work, but they still want to get the plant working, right? So remote access to control and tell these devices what to do is a completely new look for IoT, essentially.
Yep. Yeah, it is. And I put that in the bucket of something that we care a lot about, which is just working remotely and being a high functioning distributed team. And I have a lot of thoughts on that. We've been remote first as a company since inception. So we had an office for a while. I had a thought that we needed a fancy office to bring clients to, and impress them with like a nice conference room. But it turns out that we just used the office so little, and we've been able to, we've been 3 years now without an office. And there's no reason to carry that overhead. So anyways, point me in a direction, and I'm happy to talk about, remote collaboration, distributed teams, and how to make it work.
That's probably a whole chat in and of itself, as is the topic of coffee, most likely. This has been incredibly useful as we look towards what the future of IoT in the industrial space looks like. If there's parting thought you leave with anybody who's thinking about going in that direction for the first time, what would it be?
My parting thought would be that that thinking through and I don't know if Justin touched on this, but one of the things that I think about a lot is over-the-air firmware updates.
Yep.
And it's an area that we are like really passionate about, and it's like totally nerdy topic, but over-the-air firmware updates, and there are a lot of gotchas in that process. And it is so important when you start to get into the world of resumption and binary diffs and deltas, and how you are managing that firmware life cycle, and how you are updating devices that are out in the world. And when I think about industrial IoT and consumer IoT, and what a future looks like with billions of devices coming online and intelligence all around us, one of the key pieces of infrastructure to make that a reality is that we can communicate over the air reliably, and be able to update the firmware on all of these devices. And so my parting thought is to think through that. We typically lean on a framework called Nerves, which is an open source platform and project that we contribute to, and is a great solution for that. But again, that's probably a whole nother topic of conversation.
So it's perfect segue into reminding people that they can go watch an entire coffee chat with Justin about exactly that subject, which we'll link to right in the show notes. So you're just going to get people deeper into coffee chats. So it was perfect.
Love it.
We should pay you for marketing.
happy to help. This has been great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and make sure that you come back and join us twice a month for our 15-minute security chats to learn more about different ways to secure your organization. Thanks. Bye.